So, we all settled? Beau, the
Like in elementary school. It's a nice.
the spotlight's on Beau.
Awkward for that.
Well, gang, as I was putting together my questions last night, one of the things that everyone was tweeting about was how Trump had not tweeted for the fourth longest period in his entire presidency. Did you guys see this? And this was going to be a big deal. And of course, he does not disappoint. He broke his silence this morning. And of course, his tweet was, despite so many false statements and lies, total and complete vindication. And wow, Comey is a leaker. And by the way, from what we've heard and understand about what may have happened in Russia, the term leaker is very, perhaps, unfortunate. So, let's start off. I mean, first off, with the news changing so fast, I mean, we also got to talk about the UK and what's going on there today as well. Like literally, you go off Twitter for half an hour and you come back and the world has completely changed. And as storytellers, that must be just nerve-wracking. I mean, first off, how do you even keep up and how do you pay attention when you've got jobs, you've got other things going on?
Well, I mean, I'm writing a show about a planet that's been invaded by turtle raptors from space. So, it's the biggest worry isn't so much how it's going to affect the topicality of the turtle raptors from space.
Yeah.
But more sort of like how can I possibly focus, to get into the headspace of turtle raptors from space. And, and there's a lot of stress eating involved in between. Like I'll write a scene and then I'll eat a cheese stick. Then I'll write a line and I'll eat another cheese stick, so there's a lot of that. So it's more than anything else, the sort of torrent of news and information is more about the stuff you do to mitigate your stress in between trying to be productive.
Yeah. Well, how about the rest of you? I mean, what's the mood like in the writers' rooms these days? Is it tough to focus? Does every conversation eventually devolve into politics, or are you able to sort of put it aside?
In my room, I have a no computer, no cell phone rule. So there's a complete kind of blackout from news, and the second we take a break, everyone runs to the office, grabs a cell phone, and then usually one person comes in and fills us in on everything. So we then spend the next hour, instead of the 10-minute break, spends an hour break as we're all just talking about how horrendous everything is and how depressing it is, and then we try to go back to being funny. So it's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had we just came off a long run. Our writers' room wrapped like basically 1st of December, and then everybody was off for 6 months, and I was off for about 2 months prior to that. So I got so smart in those 2 months. I was like reading Twitter all day long and reading the news and reading the Wall Street Journal and listening to Pod Save America. And yes, thank you. And got so smart that I don't want to give up. I don't want to not be smart like that. But it is hard because now I have a job again, and going to work and trying to be focused in that 8-hour stretch, you miss 6 news cycles. It's not just like, oh, what I missed today. You miss like 9 things that happened like in the 45-minute intervals over the course of the day. So it is. We do, however, have TVs in our lobby in my office. So every time you go pee, you get the news.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Again, back to the leakers. I don't know what's going on. Well, what was it like in the writers' room right after the election? Like the day after the election, what was the mood? Did you get anything done? What was sort of the general feeling of what was going on?
It was, I was not personally there. I was actually, I fled. I was in New York City shooting, and the show I was on got shut down, so I went home to Atlanta. But from what I've been told, it was just absolute sorrow, horror, depression. And on Vampire Diaries specifically, they were shooting, we work in Atlanta, so it's not all rah-rah elitist libtards, right? But they were shooting a really difficult scene where a woman is, in a violent situation, and our actress of color, and the set we were on was a former plantation. And, we have a lot of people of color on our crew just being like, this is fucked today. Like, we just don't want to be here. And it was not good for anybody.
Well, Beau, you've been active. You've been sort of active in sort of some community building and talk about balancing writing and your Hollywood work with some of your political work.
I was not in a writer's room on the day of the election. I was actually in Miami. The next day I was supposed to start participating in this summit of people from leaders from different industries and fields that meet once a year to talk about a lot of interesting things. And I was knocking on doors in Little Havana on the day of the election, and we all. I come from Missouri, so I sort of felt that it was going to be a lot closer than a lot of my friends in New York or LA thought it was going to be. I still thought Hillary was going to win, but I was like, this is going to be a real squeaker because, I grew up in the part of the country that elected this guy, and you could feel it in that part of the country when I went home for the holidays. I was still shocked. I mean, when those returns started coming in, and it started to dawn upon everyone what would happen. And I called the organizers of the summit, and I said, I've got to get home. I've got to leave. I've got to bail on this summit, and I've got to get back to New York and start thinking about what I can do right away. I had no idea what that was going to be, but I knew that this was catastrophic, and there was not a moment to waste. There was 1 year, 364 days until the midterms. And I had a little political experience from my youth and a number of contacts still in that world, and it was clear that it was time to dive back in ways that I hadn't been active in the years previous, aside from helping to raise money and do stuff like that. Actually, what the organizers of the summit said is like, is there anything you can do here? And I thought, well, there's a lot of smart, successful people at this summit who normally wouldn't be in the same room together. So if I could start organizing action sessions right away with these people, starting to stumble forward in concrete actions that we could start taking together, that might be a useful exercise. And we started to do that, and it was incredibly productive. And from that, I started to call my friends in different cities around the country, including Caitlin and Emily from ATX, founders of ATX, and said, let's start doing these action sessions in different cities around the nation. And started doing them in New York and LA, then Austin and Santa Fe and Charlotte, North Carolina, Oxford, Mississippi, Nashville, Tennessee, Cheyenne, Wyoming, so on and so forth. And it was incredible, the sort of wave of enthusiasm to try to correct this wrong. And so what I found was that for the first couple months after the election, it was really hard to focus on anything else. It felt as though, the whole country had been sort of slapped across the face with the 2x4, and you're sort of reeling from it, and then saying, okay, I got to get up, dust off, and what can we do to fight back? And it's become a negotiation, really, to sort of balance one's time between what you're able to do as an artist creatively in terms of holding a mirror up to society and reflecting, but that's a process that's not immediate. It takes time. And what you can do in any given moment, day, hour, second, which is sort of the heart of political activism, which is reacting in the now and being proactive about tomorrow. I think that that's a new reality for people that want to be involved. And it's been an interesting balance to strike, and involved a lot less sleep and a lot more coffee, but the resistance is strong. We're seeing that every day, and I maintain hope.
Liz, follow that up.
Yeah,
How,
that's not possible.
but how is it impacting you?
Well, I mean, back to the question you were asking before, showrun casual, and when we came in the day after, we didn't know whether to cancel the room. We didn't know whether to keep working. We all just kind of stumbled into work. Everybody's eyes were bloodshot. Nobody could believe it. We had definitely left the day before. There was like a varying degree of nerves. I had felt pretty nervous all day, but was also had kind of told myself, I'm just going to be excited today because today history is going to be made, and I'm going to bring my son, and we're going to all go vote, and it's going to be memorable. And then obviously what happened, and we all just kind of, sat around looking at each other, wondering what to do. And then, texts started coming in from Tara, who plays Laura on the show, and she's like, I want to be anti-Trump. I want my character to be anti-Trump. And then Michaela, what are we going to do? What are you doing in there? And it was this, we all kind of had this call to action of, it was actually right at a point where we were kind of, our season was a little different this year, where we kind of, the first 2 episodes are their own little story, and then the 3rd episode is really what launches the season. So we were at this point of still being able to kind of decide our season arcs, and it definitely impacted our youngest character's, Laura's story, the teenager on the show. We decided with her we were going to kind of go a more political route. Again, as a backdrop, Casual's it's not a political show in any means. It's a show that I think has a lot of social commentary. And certainly these characters don't shy away from their opinions, and you can kind of imagine what they are. But with Laura, we really were able to kind of create this different backdrop for her story that I don't think would have occurred to us to do had that not happened.
Well, I definitely want to talk more about that with everyone, but first, Paul, I want to give you a chance to
Sure.
talk about how you're sort of balancing the New World Order with your day job.
Sure. So for us, I had a weird duality experience where I was in the midst of 2 shows. So we have Queen Sugar, which was 10 weeks into a writer's room, into a 20 weeks writer's room. And in that show, where it's very modern day, rural South, I think it caused us to kind of reframe what the show was just from a different lens, from the different political landscape. But at the exact same time, with the writer room closed, we were 6 episodes into shooting Underground, which is about the rural South, but in the middle of slavery. And that one was, it was odd because we were, filming the night of the election. And we were shooting out of order because our lead actress was 8 months pregnant when we were shooting. So we had to stack the season with her work up front. And we were saving an episode at the very end, and the show creator, Misha Green, was writing that episode as we were shooting. And it was a 40-minute monologue of Harriet Tubman, and it was called Minty, and it was just literally Harriet Tubman telling her story. And I really think that the election influenced Misha's tone in that monologue, and it ended with this amazing call to action, to almost direct it to the audience, like, are you a citizen or are you a soldier? And so for me it was really odd because I was looking through it from the lens of, kind of the ancestors and how it affected our modern day characters.
Well, yeah, and that's something I've heard a lot from showrunners in the past couple of months, because everyone was in the middle of their seasons this past year, and a lot of shows had to sort of quickly readjust. They had sort of written some storylines, even storylines that weren't political, but with this thought that, next year there's going to be a female president, and so we should make references like this, and suddenly everyone was quickly having to redo things. How much did that impact all of you, and what kind of reworking of the pieces you were working on did you have to make in light of the election?
Well, let me just say this. One of my EPs on Queen Sugar thought maybe she'd run for president, which was Oprah. So it definitely affected her.
Yeah. And by the way, can you urge her to do so?
Absolutely.
I wish someone from Homeland was here, because the season of Homeland.
Oh my
this
God.
season
Spot
was
on.
Yeah.
So spot on and amazing, and you couldn't believe what you were watching. And I would love to dissect that with Alex Gonza and hear him talk about it for 2 days straight.
Right. Well, and one thing was obviously the relationship between the president-elect and the intelligence community, and clearly they had to sort of adjust it, and it was pretty amazing. But for all of you, speaking of which, things are happening so fast now, and we're kind of through the looking glass. Truth, the question of truth is up in the air. That sort of messes with stories. Nothing is unbelievable anymore. So how do you write unbelievable storylines when real headlines are beating you to the punch, and oftentimes are more outlandish than anything that you could ever create in the writer's room?
Well, the basics haven't changed is the thing. When I'm writing the Dark Crystal prequel, but nevertheless, we're dealing with universal themes. The weirdest thing in our show is that our show was originally called Age of Rebellion, and it turns out that George Lucas owns everything that says rebellion on it. So so we had to change the name to something. So eventually came up Age of Resistance, and that's the title of our show, which we thought we were going to get groans from a lot of people because it seems like we're sort of appropriating a term that's very topical, and instead it seems to have been greeted really well. But I think that you know, the basics of what we've been writing about the entire time, which is about standing up to power, standing up to overwhelming authority, not accepting hagiographical narratives of why authority deserves its authority, all of those things are baked into the DNA of a lot of what we write anyway. And especially if you're a guy like me who's been doing mostly fantasy, science fiction, and horror type stuff, writing about current events in metaphor is not unknown territory. This is what I've been doing my entire career. So really, some of the things get sharper, but you still focus on the basics of what drama is. And for me, especially writing in this genre so much of what I write about is about the relationship of people to power. So that part of it really stays consistent.
I think, circling back to the question about how does it impact kind of what we do and how we tell the stories, is that for me personally, it has recontextualized the way I look at certain things. You know, I've spent the last 8 years in the vampire genre, which is, you know, from the beginning, the advent of the genre itself has been very steeped in deep gothic roots, very, you know, almost, it's a very predatory, seductive, sensual character, the vampire. There is a rape culture thread that weaves through it, and it's kind of in that like bodice rippy way of all the romance novels that I grew up reading. It's always been really sexy and interesting to me, and it, you know, sort of starting with that debate where Donald Trump was just circling Hillary and interrupting her, and the puppet, you know, no, you're the puppet, and bullying her and coming at her and being so predatory. It made me so sick that all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. You know, I can read studies about feminism in storytelling. I can read studies about, you know, I can read people's reactions, like the bury your gays argument of last year. You know, I can understand why people are upset about that, but I can also, as a storyteller, say, hey, wait a second, like. Somebody just said this in my room the other day. We're equal opportunity killers, and I said, not anymore. You know, and it really has. Now I get it. I mean, I'm coming obviously from a sort of almost unfortunate place of privilege that I am just now saying that. You know, like, oh, Donald Trump got elected, and now I woke up, but I did, and I'm happy to admit that. And now I was talking to the writer who wrote the episode that was being delivered the day after the election. Her script, and in the episode, a female character got beaten up by a man. Now, granted, it was in a memory, and it was an alternate universe, and it was, you know, in flashback period garb, and it was his own demons, but he beat her up. And we all decided on that day that those two can't be together anymore. And we killed a love story on that day that probably most people who watched the show are actually still rooting for. And that's a really weird feeling to know that, like, narratively, you've been going down this path, but now your conscience can't advocate that kind of violence and continue to lean into it, you know? And she even said last night, she's like, I think I ruined the show. And I'm like, you didn't ruin the show. We'll be fine, you know? But yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff is what's happening in our rooms and in our creative minds.
The new show that I'm working on, I started conceiving of and working on over 2 years ago in a very different political climate, and it takes place in the near future, about 15, 20 years in the future. So it's interesting as one is working on story and developing story, you have to speculate and imagine what the world will look like 15, 20 years from now.
Does it still exist?
Well, that, you know, prior to November 8th, 2016, what that world looked like maybe was a lot different, you know? And to put that in perspective, let's just use somewhere in the middle, 17 years ago. 17 years ago, 9/11 hadn't happened yet. We were at the very beginning of George W. Bush's presidency. No one knew who Barack Obama was. And Donald Trump was the joke he's always been up until a very short time ago. So that gives you a sense of how much the world can change in 17 years. You also didn't have iPhones, you know, and Twitter didn't exist, right? That's just 17. That's just 17 years. In fact, Facebook didn't exist.
That's like saying oxygen didn't exist.
That's 17 years from now, right?
Right.
So when you think of like, you know, okay, it's 17 years, the world won't, you know, we're fundamentally the same human beings we've been for millennia. The same universal stories apply. And yet how quickly our world is moving and how much can change. And when you have these sort of traumatic events, I mean, whether you support Trump or not, and I take it that most of you probably do not, although there might be a few of you in this room, it's still a traumatic event for the country, one way or the other, in terms of the schism, the divisiveness, and the polarization. And we will be contending with those consequences, those ripple effects for decades to come. And it's interesting, as storytellers, you sort of say to yourself, well, I mean, let me back up for a second. I believe all stories are political. Every single story is political, whether it's about politics or not. I'll use a random example. My Fair Lady. Any musical fans in here? Yeah. Okay. My Fair Lady is incredibly political. It has to do with gender, with class, with identity politics, and you know, traced all the way back to Pygmalion, a story of reinvention and how do you sort of define your place in society by the public image that you present to the world. Incredibly political. So, but oftentimes if you're working on something that isn't overtly political, you aren't necessarily thinking about it in that context, even if your political beliefs and worldview are seeping into every word you write. And I think now, my general sense among the writers I know is that we're hyper aware. That even if you're not doing a political show, you're recognizing, no matter what genre, no matter what character, that there are political implications to every narrative choice you make.
And it feels like if the day-to-day culture is saying it's okay to not be inclusive, it's okay to not be tolerant, it's okay to be bigoted, then your responsibility as a storyteller feels like if you disagree with that, you have to double down on making it okay in your storytelling to be inclusive and to be tolerant and to, you know, making it not okay to be a bigot. And that, it's like the weight of that is always hanging in a good way.
Yeah, that's right. What are your blind spots? You know, and really quickly, another thing I've noticed it's like is overtly political in the way that writers exist in the world. Is we have a union called the Writers Guild of America. I serve on the council for the East, and you guys might be aware that there was negotiations for our contract with the AMPTP, which are the producers organization it's basically like management on the other side of the table. And I was on the negotiating committee for that, and in a lot of our meetings leading up, the joint council East and West meetings and the negotiating committee meetings, it was very much in the context of a Trump America. This sense that, you know, as organized labor, which is what we are, that you know, there was a political moment here that the only way things happen politically is when you stand up for yourself, that there is not a time in our nation's history to sort of sit down, be quiet, and hope for the best, that nothing happens unless you make it happen. And that, you know, those sort of conversations happening within the union are not ones that have been happening to that level or degree in years past. So I think that, you know, I only bring that up as an example because there's a charged sort of political consciousness that's happening among the screenwriters and television writers of this country, which I think you're going to see percolating into almost everything you watch.
There's definitely a direct correlation between the quality of the deal that we got from management and the election of Donald Trump, because I feel like, as you said, you went to those meetings and it was like this was a thing that we as writers could make happen immediately, and a lot of that displaced anger, I think, led to us being able to say authorize a strike vote by 96%. I think people were genuinely looking at somebody to stick it to who had been sticking it to us, you know, and I do believe that the militancy that the guild showed in this negotiation is directly influenced in a huge way by that, and hopefully that'll also wind up on TV screens at some point.
One thing I want to ask you guys, Hollywood is also, of course, a whipping boy, and it's become even more of a whipping boy among the political, on the right side. And ironically, Trump was sort of built by Hollywood. He would never be president if he was not the host of The
And they won't
Apprentice.
let us forget it.
Steve Bannon made his millions of dollars because he owns a chunk of Seinfeld. So these guys were created by Hollywood, but yet they love to bash Hollywood every chance they get, as sort of out of touch, as in its own little bubble. What do you make of that, and how much of it is true? How much are we in a bubble, and how is that sort of maybe hurting the cause, hurting the resistance at the same time?
I would just say that there's so much hypocrisy going on, and what you just talked about is a central part of it. And I think that it really, for the room I'm in right now, it really helps us in terms of good guys and bad guys, in terms of gray area, in terms of what people can get away with. One of the things about this election that creatively was interesting was, sometimes you feel like there are no more surprises left, and the world is at such a place that nothing can take you off guard. And this election happens, and everyone's like, whoa, and you have to reevaluate everything. And I think that there's a reset that happens both as people and also as a creative person in terms of how you shift the tectonic plates of what you thought was good, what you thought was bad, how you get away with things. And so in the show I'm doing now, we have the first gay lead character on, I think, any network hour long, certainly this network, which is CBS. And in the testing for the pilot, he's a gay married man to another man. And in testing the pilot, the second his husband came on screen, the dials plummeted. No one wanted it. And this was like a 15-second thing. The second the husband left, they shot back up. And this happened the two times the husband was in the scene. And it was this moment of, like with Trump winning, like with the inherent racism against Obama and sexism against Hillary, where you start to think, okay, we've made a ton of progress in this country, and we're so much farther along than we may be, but there's still so much latent hatred. There's still so much latent misogyny and racism, and it kind of forces you to figure out the balance of how you want to tell these stories. And I think the hypocrisy that's going on now, in terms of these people who are bashing the very business that made them, helps us frame good versus evil. And that, how you position it and how you find a context to tell those stories.
We live in such hypocrisy times, right? I mean, when you can dig up any old Donald
and
Trump
the lack
tweet.
of fact, the lack of truth, the fact that you can it's chaos in a way, in that the leader of what we call the free world is just blatantly lying and making stuff up and refuting the truth. And it forces all of us to reevaluate what the meaning of truth is and to try to stay strong to it.
Well, let's do a little experiment. Where are you guys from? Where are you from?
Chicago.
Chicago.
Texas and Connecticut.
Texas and Connecticut. Where are you from?
The Midwest, Chicago.
Right on.
New York City.
New York.
San Juan, Puerto Rico.
All right, Puerto Rico, and I'm from Missouri, right? It's not a collection of like coastal elites here, I'm from Missouri. My dad spent 30 years in the Navy. My grandfather was a coal miner. My mom never went to college, started working when she was 17. I've worked in factories. I've worked as a barista. I've detailed cars. I imagine pretty much everyone here has done a job for minimum wage or close to it at some point in their lives. The people that we are privileged enough to employ are unionized labor that work 12-hour days or more, working their butts off in order to make an actual product, a thing that we actually sell to other people that they choose to buy, like we're making something. And I would say, you look at the sort of work that the folks in Hollywood do that is not, it's not glitzy and glamorous. It's getting up at 6 a.m. and busting your ass day after day with a lot of hardworking people who aren't necessarily earning a ton of money. In the average writer room, these are squarely middle-class people that are working in this writer's room. I think there's a misperception about when you look at red carpets or the sort of glossy tabloid rags of what Hollywood is. But I think you'll even find that a lot of the big movie stars that you admire started out at some point struggling, just like many of us have. I was talking to an actor yesterday who's become extremely successful, and she was talking about waiting tables like many of us have had to do when we were first starting out. In terms of being out of touch, I mean, you're only as out of touch as you choose to be. And we have a president who's never known what it means to have a real job or to struggle, to earn anything, who inherited more money than any of us will ever earn in our lives. When you think about what sort of bubbles people live in.
Who doesn't read?
Yeah, that's right.
Proudly does not read.
Yeah, I think that the hypocrisy level there is pretty extreme. Certainly, all of the people sitting up here don't have a lot of sympathy for Donald Trump. I think some stereotypes are true that Hollywood does toward the lean to the left. But ask yourself why artists tend to be more liberal than not. I think it's because these tend to be people that have read a lot, whether they went to school or not, that empathize with other people, that are curious about the world, and that ultimately, when you write, you're doing so out of some sort of moral compass of this is the way the world is, and let me imagine what the world could be, for better or for worse. That's what being in touch is all about. And the people that first stood up around the campfire a couple million years ago when language was just being formed were trying to communicate to their other cave people about what they saw on the other side of the horizon, about what was possible, about what was scary, about what we needed to know about ourselves in order to survive. It's a necessary and noble craft to tell stories. It's what allows us to understand ourselves. And so talk about the bubbleness, talk about the glitziness and the glamour and all that stuff. It's not why any of these people who are successful, who really stick to it, started. They started because they have a desperate need to communicate with other human beings. And the only way that our president attempts to do that is at 140 characters or less between the hours of 6 and 9 a.m. in Mar-a-Lago.
Let me tell you something about being an out-of-touch coastal elite, and apropos of your asking where we came from. So, I grew up in Puerto Rico, which has systematically, over the course of the last century, been turned by the United States into a tax-free haven for industry, and into a paradise for free market capitalism through a number of things, and a country where the citizens, only have a limited say in the direction politically of the nation because of being essentially a de facto colony of the United States. And it's interesting for me watching what's going on right now, which is a great deal of showmanship, which is really concealing the robbery of a lot of our economic safeguards in the name of tax breaks for the rich and in the names of tax breaks for industry. So whenever they say, whenever I hear about the coastal elites being out of touch, I look at where I came from and I look at what happened to my country because of the political will of this country. And I say to myself, you have no frickin' idea how in touch and how much I know the future that you have elected for yourselves. And it is often crazy making for me to look at the amount of sort of distraction that happens because of the political circus that's going on, that's actually taking our minds off the truth, which is that basically every economic safety net that's been put in place for us is about to be taken from us by robber barons. And frankly, anybody who tells me that I'm out of touch, I just suggest that they take a quick trip to where I grew up, and I say, look at your future, and then come and tell me that I'm out of touch. I also suggest that they read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which is a book about how the forces of free market capitalism use political and natural disasters in order to reframe the economic parameters of a nation, and look at your country and see what's being done here, because it is exactly that.
I want to get back to storytelling real quick. One of the interesting things that happened after the election is you had a couple of network executives, Channing Dungey, the head of ABC, for example, say, hey, you know what? maybe we have missed telling some stories. Maybe we've missed telling some Middle America stories. We've been focused lately on these big glamorous soap operas, et cetera. We're going to focus a little bit more on Middle America, on sort of the people who, maybe voted for Trump because they felt like the elites, the coastal elites, weren't paying attention to them. Do you think there's some truth to that? Do you think Hollywood is sort of adjusting at all? And how do you walk that line? Because that's also code for maybe we're going to tell less stories about, sort of the under-examined or the underprivileged. It does seem like we're walking a fine line here in Hollywood and the kinds of stories that we tell.
I read that and I was like, yes, of course, we should always be telling stories about everybody. So it's like, don't just be like, hey, gee, we forgot to tell stories about half the country. Like, I think every storyteller is always attempting to do that.
Yeah.
The market, sort of the buyer's market shifts in size and creaks and groans, and then everybody's got a, honor duty soldier show coming on next year now as a result of this. And literally, I have a friend who just wrote a spec that's kind of rooted in that, and I was like, hey, way to be topical, And first thing out of the mouth of the studio was, you say the word military now because everyone's got their military show and everyone's rolling their eyes like they're done with military, and I'm like, well, here's the problem, here's the problem.
Yeah.
Don't just prescribe a statistic of what you need to make sure you hit. Just make sure that you're like rolling with character, more than you're rolling with concept.
Yeah, that's where the Hollywood cynicism kind of comes in a little bit.
I think it's almost, I don't know. I think about it in terms of like kind of my own development moving forward, and how you do address that. For me, I think so much of what I've been attracted to lately is telling stories, especially in the development I'm working on, about like women who are refusing to kind of play the game and put themselves in a box. And I almost think we can reach those places by, this is a sidebar, but did anyone watch Survivor this season? The best show ever that I still watch, that nobody watches except probably everyone in Middle America. But something happened on Survivor this season. I'm not spoiling it because it already happened. But where, for anyone who watched it, there was a character, quick.
They're people. They're actual people.
They're actual people, yeah. But there was a character, Zeke, who had been, it was like one of those seasons where they bring back people from previous seasons, and so Zeke had been on season before. He was beloved. Anyway, what ended up happening at Tribal Council was he was outed by a guy named Varner, who was also beloved, and it was very surprising that Varner did this. I was caught off guard. But Varner, all of a sudden, and it's, you go crazy on Survivor, and you forget, and you like start, and you're always like, you can push boundaries, and you can lie to people, and that's fine. And it was very interesting because this really drew a line of what you could and couldn't do. But anyway, Varner said at Tribal Council, Zeke's not being honest with you because Zeke's keeping a secret, and I don't know if you know it, but Zeke, why haven't you told anyone that you're transgender? And everybody freaked out, but not in the way you would think, where you might think that people would look at Zeke and be like, what? Everybody looked, including Jeff Probst, looked at this guy Varner, and they were like, what the fuck is wrong with you? People burst into tears. Everybody was like, you do not do that to somebody. That is wrong. And honestly, like, I sobbed my face off watching it. My wife and I sobbed our faces off. And it was so incredibly moving, and I was like, that will do more. That will do more, taking this character that is probably beloved by all these people in all those red states who never knew this about him, and nobody could look at that guy and say, that is not a man. That will do more for bathrooms in North Carolina than probably Caitlyn Jenner, Transparent, which are doing a ton, but it speaks in a language that people understand. And I guess what I'm saying is people, I watch the show too, but like I do feel like Survivor probably has a pretty universal, it's not a coastal elite show, put it that way.
Right.
Like Queer Eye, like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy.
Absolutely.
It was like so in the issue you bring up, just really quick, because I'd love to hear about how underground came to be. And the reason I'm asking is because when I was in grad school around 2001 or 2, we had an assignment where we had to come up with a pilot, an idea for a show. And one of the ones that I came up with was my family in South Carolina way back when had plantations on my dad's side, owned slaves. And it's a weird thing to know that this is in your family history. And I came up with an idea of wanting to tell a story of a plantation during the Civil War, but entirely from the perspective of the slaves. And my teachers were all saying to me, no network will ever touch this in a million years. Great idea, but put it in a drawer. I think it's extraordinary that in a very short amount of time, we now have stories that are finally reaching television screen that in decades past never had a chance. And so when there's this like whiplash of, now we got to tell middle America stories, about white working class people, and you're like, hold on. There's a whole shit ton of stories that we've barely begun to tell. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, when I hear that, I mean, I'm working on, a show about the Underground Railroad, and I'm working on a show about, female black rural Louisiana farmers, which is, clearly there's so many farmers down there that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And Underground shot in New Orleans, and so does Queen Sugar, and I shot on the same plantations for both shows. And it's just so odd to be in a space where you're almost being asked to justify the lens at which you're trying to show a story. And so, just to answer your question, I mean, Underground just came about, I think, because of a kind of critical mass of cable television, this new kind of magic medium where all of a sudden you had tons of networks that were looking for an identity that used to live on syndication. And now syndication wasn't how you were going to make your mark, and people were looking for new shows to, trumpet as our original, our thing. And WGN was that network. They were, kind of like the modern day Superstation in Atlanta, which was a terrestrial station in Chicago that now all of a sudden became a cable station and needed signature programming. And Underground just spoke to something that was unique at the time. And it's just very ironic that Underground is in flux right now because a particular media group, Sinclair Media Group, purchased WGN. And Sinclair is a very conservative group. And so now there's really no place for this show about the Underground Railroad. And ironically, in our kind of post-conversations, the post-mortem of where it is now, it's like, we have a show that one of the lead characters last season was Harriet Tubman. Which I couldn't have imagined. I mean, you talk about 17 years. I couldn't imagine 5 years ago that there would be a show where Harriet Tubman is the star, superhero, going out with guns and an axe, freeing slaves. Like, you just wouldn't have imagined that could happen. And then as quickly as it happened, all of a sudden there's a shift, and now there's no place for it. And as everyone here knows, TV is such an odd business, and the margins for success and failure are so narrow that it's kind of like successful shows are successful not just because of all the great creatives involved, but because they hit the marketplace at the right time and reach the right audience. I kind of look at our mission. Though I never kind of took it as, hey, we need to tell different stories, and maybe it's because I'm an African American male, and I feel like there haven't been an adequate amount of stories being told. And even with Queen Sugar, where before any of this stuff happened, Ava DuVernay, who created the show, committed just kind of out of the blue that she wanted to have all female directors. She didn't want any male directors on the show, and because she just felt like I have 3 lead female characters on my show, and I want them to make sure that voice is heard. And then after the election, it felt like, oh, wow, that was clearly the right decision. Not that regardless in the Obama America or the Trump America, women directors were, there weren't enough of them happening. They weren't getting opportunities. The ironic thing is, and I think that, what we all should be doing is just moving forward, doing what we know we're supposed to do. Every last one of the women that we hired last season, we couldn't hire again this season because they're all working. And before last season, they couldn't get a job.
Yeah, I tried to hire. I had your list. I'm like, look at this great list of women that have worked in Atlanta. Like, get them. And they're like, they're unavailable forever. Like,
Yeah.
you'll never see them again.
You know, so just that one little action changed the perspective of Hollywood. And it's ironic that, you know, Hollywood is considered this kind of beacon where I think all of us feel like we're fighting every day to make it that. It's not that by nature. It's a business by nature.
Well, that's the irony of course, we went through Oscars So White, and television was starting to make some real strides and continues to make real strides. And then I think the fear was after the election, there was going to be this knee-jerk reaction, like that comment of, uh-oh, we got to go back to doing Middle America stuff now, and maybe Hollywood might erase some of the strides that they had made. So really, it's about being vigilant and making sure that we don't go backwards.
Well, it's funny because, you know, in defense of Channing, who under her watch, you have Kerry Washington and Viola Davis and really strong, phenomenal, powerful women, and more so even women of color, the helms of broadcast series, which is so great, all at the same time. And so she's done all these amazing things. So I think maybe her comment is even coming from like, oh, like, my focus has to broaden as well. My priorities have to broaden as well. So I didn't mean to diss her in the comment, just so much as like, it's just that sense of like, okay, you know. But kind of going back to what you were saying, the Queer Eye for the Straight Guy begat Modern Family, begat, one could argue, Transparency.
And don't forget Will and Grace.
Oh yeah, Will and Grace, duh, hello. But like, I had a friend who was saying, you know, do you realize that Modern Family probably did more to, you know, progressing how people look at gay relationships and gay marriage specifically and gay parenting than anything else that has happened in the last 15, 20 years. And that is ultimately where our responsibility sits. Like when we all collectively are schooled by fan culture and the LGBT community saying, hey, we have noticed a trend and a pattern in the way that you treat characters that are representative of us, could you knock it off? We have a responsibility to knock it off and to understand things. And so when you're in a culture that is, and I, you know, sort of repeating myself, but that is where you feel like you're in an ideological war with a culture of the types of people who think it is okay to be cruel, to be bullies, to be bigoted, etc. Like, I just feel like what we can do as writers is really make sure that we're showing everybody, and we're like leaning into love in the way that we can. I mean, I know that's kind of kumbaya, but to show what they were showing on Sense8 before it got canceled, to, you know, to show people of all shapes, sizes, races, and beliefs, and celebrate it.
Well, one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Because, Beau, I wanted to ask you a specific question about, for the folks who are doing shows about Washington and government and D.C., how tough is their job now? If I'm writing about, say, the FBI and the CIA, I mean, even what happened yesterday...
I got out at just the right time.
I think so. But when you see what happened yesterday with Comey on the stand, and you know, we're through the looking glass, how does one even write about politics in this day and age?
Look, I mean, there's a whole lot of talented people that are writing about politics with, I think, great effectiveness and insight, whether it's coming from a comedic place or dramatic place or somewhere in between. I mean, you write about politics the way writers have written about politics going back to the Greeks. You know, I don't think we're living in a unique time. Actually, when you look at like the vast spectrum of human history, and you look at artists working in other countries where you can actually get killed or imprisoned for what you write. You know, the great privilege that we have in America still, you know, TBD to see where we'll be in a few years from now, to be able to express ourselves in a way where we don't suffer the same consequences that writers for centuries have been facing elsewhere. I mean, Shakespeare always had to worry about the queen or the king shutting down a theater if they just didn't like what they were seeing at the Old Globe there. So I think that it's an impossibly broad question you're asking, because you're saying, how do people write about politics? And people are always writing about politics, whether they're writing about politics or not. If you're talking about how do people write about the specific world of Washington, D.C. and all the players there, and in a medium where even though it moves faster than film does in a lot of ways, you're still many months behind current events. Look, that's always a tricky thing, and people have found solutions to that, whether it's homeland adjusting or, the different approaches that Veep took, and sometimes you miss the mark a little bit, but that's okay. The goal is to do your best to react to in a moment something that is true. And what is true now, will that be true 6 months from now? Sometimes it is, and if it's not, at least then you're able to have that sort of like historical irony to be able to compare what was 6 months ago to what is now, which is valuable in and of itself. It's an imperfect science. There's no. I wish there was an answer for that. If I could write that book, I'd be extremely powerful and wealthy man. But it's. I think that everyone's doing a pretty fine job of groping through the darkness.
Well, talk about historical irony. Like, I feel like this panel can't end without talking about Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I sit there and I watch it. I'm like, if Hillary was president, this would be a very intelligent and entertaining show. Yeah. Donald Trump is president, and
Terrifying.
I want to vomit.
It just keeps getting funnier every single time I see it.
It is so harrowing in the context of the reality that we live in. The speculative fiction feels so specifically, presently of today, in a way that it absolutely wouldn't have had Hillary been president, which is, by the way, sort of what everybody probably believed when they were putting that show together.
Yeah.
But my favorite meme going around the internet right now is one that the heading goes, "Oh, a foreign power colluded to install a right-wing government in your country?" And then it says, "the rest of Latin America." And then there's a picture of John Krasinski in the office going... And if you look at some of the greatest art of the 20th century, you're talking about the playwrights, novelists, and people who came out of, sadly, through great and horrible personal misfortune, things like the Soviet Union, things like the military dictatorships in Latin America in the 1980s, Central America in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and the light degree to which we can catastrophize the coming of Donald Trump to any number of ways, because we are used to having a way of life politically that is relatively easy compared to the rest of the world. But if what we're going through right now as a country can energize us as artists and you as consumers of art, and perhaps even artists yourselves, to create in a way that encourages people not just to resist politically, but to openly stand up for the right to live the best life that you can possibly have on your own terms as your own person, there's a chance that for all of our catastrophizing, all of our depressive, self-loathing feeling that this is only all going to end in tears, there is a strong possibility that great art can come out of this, and that politically we can be okay. But it requires the engagement of everybody who makes art, and a real sort of commitment to making art that empowers people, whether it's politically, whether it's personally, whether it's in terms of their gender or their sexuality or whatever, to be the most honest version of that. Because the only way that we survive is by being the most honest version of ourselves we can and telling the world to go fuck itself if they don't like it.
All I know is, watching the Comey testimony yesterday, if this was an actual TV show, he would have slapped a smoking gun on the desk and we'd be done with this already. Yeah. So... If only. Well, let's open it up to the audience. I'm sure you have some questions. Right here.
I'm curious, Michael, when you were saying that, when they were testing your show, the dials went down and everything plummeted when the husband came on screen. How did your bosses and the higher-ups at CBS react? Because there are some instances where, we are being more inclusive and we're resisting and everything. There are still some instances where, we try to step up to Trump and resist and be more inclusive and everything, and it still gets shot down. So I'm curious how they reacted when that happened.
We expected it, and we, meaning really me. I mean, one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this show was because I had to deal with CBS. I love the people at CBS. I did a show for them about 9 years ago that was basically a musical comedy, romantic comedy, and
best show.
And they were,
Love Monkey?
yes, Love Monkey, yes, and they were it was like amazing of them that they bought it, that they made the pilot, that they put it in the air, and they were so supportive of it, and then they canceled it after 3 episodes. So it was like not the network for me, and my feeling was I want to do a CBS procedural, but I want to do one that's different, that changes the game in some way. And so having a gay male lead who was CIA, and it felt like the opportunity to do that, but it was a big gamble of, you guys want to be more diverse. They took a lot of hell last year at the upfronts because of that. So it felt like they were going to buy it, but were they going to support it? And in this situation, the warning them of this is not going to test well. There's a whole adoption story with these 2 men who love each other very much. The whole point was to tell a story about 2 men who are married and have it be a domestic marriage story, not a gay marriage story. But what it did was, for me, realize that the CBS audience is different from a premium cable audience. It's different from a streaming audience. That it doesn't change at all the stories you want to tell. What I think it did for us was realize we have to slow it down a little bit. That we can't do too much too soon, and that a story that could have been in the first 2 or 3 episodes, we may have to introduce more slowly so that it plays out over 4 or 5 or 6 episodes. That being said, up to this point, the studio and the network have been nothing but supportive about it. The president of the network at the time was Glenn Geller, who just left. He's an out gay man. The story was very personal to him. He was really excited about it. The guys who have replaced him have been very supportive so far, too. So I don't know how it's going to go, but we knew going into it. I don't think I expected the dials were going to plummet that much. And the men who were being in the Q&A afterwards at the focus group, they all said, "Oh, we have no problem with gay marriage. We have no one stepped up to say, even though they all obviously didn't like it, except one guy said, I don't mind gay marriage, I just don't want it shoved in my face." And it was, again, this recognition of both how far we've come and how far there is to go. And to have the opportunity to tell these stories like A Modern Family did, like Will and Grace did, except in an hour-long format, and to try to do it in a way that is truthful, but also that feels like it is going to be able to hopefully change some minds, and to try to be patient with it.
Thanks for your question. Over here.
As someone that's part of a startup that the whole Trump issue is completely determined how we have to come to market now, has there been any instances that you can think of where a concept or a writer has brought something geared towards Trump or his administration where they've had to be mixed or steered in a different direction, or the pressure of bringing it to the audience has just, you haven't been able to do it?
I had sort of the reverse Handmaid's Tale experience where I was producing a pilot last year that was about a homegrown coup. We're taking out a president like a Clinton or an Obama and installing a new leader who ultimately felt very, in a fascist way, like somehow would define Trump. And so when we were developing it in a Hillary future, it was really smart, riveting, excellent, fun entertainment. And when the election happened, suddenly it felt very sort of too close to home, uncomfortable, too political. And it went from, in a span of 2 weeks, went from being the high priority project at the network to not getting ordered at all. So nobody said, oh, it's because Trump is president. But they didn't say corporately like, oh no, you can't do that. We don't want to upset Trump. So it's not totally specific to your example, but it did sort of, the ripple effect of the context was instant. It was wild.
We're just getting to sort of a pitching stage again. We're already talking about next season, development, all that. Do you get a sense that because, as a nation, we're sort of traumatized at the moment, that we might be going in a more blue sky direction? Do you think people want a little more escapist fare right now?
I think that Wonder Woman made $175 million at the box office in its first weekend. And you're going to get a lot of, whether they're black, white, Asian, gay, straight, whatever, you're going to have a lot of women kicking ass. I think that's, Hollywood is a business, and we're not, yes, absolutely. I think it's great that Wonder Woman is doing so well, but like the mercenary side of it is that like everybody's going to be chasing after the Wonder Woman money. That's what happened yesterday, and pitching season starts next month, and they're looking at that. They're not looking at November.
Yeah. And also, by the way, a female filmmaker, Patty Jenkins, biggest open ever. So.
Yeah, and they didn't bother securing her for the sequel because
Oh, Hollywood. Oh, man. Yes, back there.
So, as you noted, our president doesn't like to read, and that's pretty obvious in his first grade reading and writing skills.
Yeah, we're not sure he can read, right?
I respect it. But so I was curious how you guys feel about upholding like the English language, if there's pressure from your producers to like dumb down the language, because I really enjoy, like a well-written line of dialogue, smart dialogue. But is that something that is still on your minds more, just because Coke, Fifi, or Coke?
I live in this like naive, tiny little bubble of Hollywood where all my bosses are really like compassionate, progressive people. And I just believe that to be true of people who make stories, which is probably not true. I just haven't, thank God, had that little tiny bubble burst by the people I work for yet. And I hope that I will not.
All my characters talk like neurotic, self-loathing, overeducated Puerto Ricans. If you don't want that, you just don't fucking hire me,
Write what you know. Any more questions? Right here.
Do you feel like it's more effective to talk about like social commentary in comedy or in drama?
I mean, both. Both. I do both comedy and drama, and I think that it's just a different approach, probably how you do it. But I don't think either is more or less powerful. I think that. Like I said, with casual, I think we're making social commentary all the time, and other stuff I'm working on now, the whole idea of it is to make social commentary and I was kind of saying before, like to look at how we view women and how we put them in boxes, and even in pitching, like I don't think I've gone into a pitch since the election and not brought up Hillary Clinton and talked about how she was asked as a woman to drop her last name, transform, cut her hair, dye it blonde, start speaking with a southern accent. Oh, walk like that. Oh, don't walk like that. Oh, talk like that, but not like that. Oh, you have to do this, and now wear this. And just the idea that then, I think back to like 2008, and even I look at myself who was like, I don't know, I just don't know if she's authentic. I'm just not sure. She's like, of course you don't know who she is. She barely knows who she is. She's been told by so many people to be somebody else. So I think now going into pitches and kind of owning that and saying, in comedy or drama, like I want to pitch female characters who are saying, fuck that, I'm not putting myself in a box, I'm going to be who I am, and I'm going to make that be enough. And so I think, like Beau was saying, whether it's Veep, whether it's House of Cards, whether it's Homeland, it's all being done in different kind of formats, mediums, but it's equally effective. I find it to be, at least.
Sort of jumping off that, the hot potato question is the line, of course, the Kathy Griffin question. And is there a line? What did you make of that, and also the reaction, the piling on that happened afterwards?
I'll dive in. Do you want?
Go for it, Julie.
Look, I think just in comedy in general, there's a line between something that's actually funny and something that's not funny, and I'm not going to objectively prescribe what I thought that moment was. I just think that, unfortunately for Kathy Griffin, she stepped into something that gave ammunition to the other side. We happen to be on this side; they are the others, and they got to have a field day with it, and they got to call us all hypocrites and tell us all we're terrible people. And yet, we went at Bill O'Reilly with everything we had, deservedly so. And they, on their side, probably felt very victimized by that. I certainly will not conflate the two actions between Bill O'Reilly and Kathy Griffin, but I just think when you're at war, just, wherever your ammunition's going to come from, if it hits in the right moment, the right zeitgeist, like whoever provided it is just dead meat for a minute.
Yeah, except Ted Nugent spent 8 years advocating open armed rebellion against
of
a black
course.
president, and now he's sitting behind the desk at the Oval Office. That much said, I wouldn't want to repress Ted Nugent's right to say whatever he wants, even if that's wango tango. I think what Kathy Griffin did, whether you like it or not, is a piece of political art. And if you look at the political art that was being done in the Weimar Republic or whatever, you're not looking at anything that's particularly. Honestly, I think that for politically conscious art, it was actually fairly mercenary and kind of banal. But she did it, and I find that we have to defend her right to do that, or we will not have the right to do much more milquetoast crap that. That is much less offensive than what she did. It goes both ways. She has a right to put that out there. She also has to take the lumps, but we have to defend her right to put it out there. And that a lot of people didn't is very disappointing.
Let's talk about this double standard. We have comedians, talk show hosts, pundits on the left and the right who are losing their jobs for saying or doing certain things. And yet the President of the United States has not lost his job for committing numerous crimes and admitting to having sexually assaulted women. So, the double standard for me is that the person that bears the most responsibility, which is the leader of the free world, should be held to the highest standard. And that seems to be the only guy who's keeping his job.
Well, I think that about wraps it up. I don't think we can.
You can change that.
Yeah. Well, Paul can change it by forcing his boss Oprah to run for office in 2020. So if there's anything we're going to take away from today,
Oprah.
Paul's going to go back to the own offices, and Beau Willimon as VP. So, well, thank you so much. This was a fun panel, and God bless us all in America. I think that's how we end it. Thanks, everyone.